Well, I'm back out in the shop space here. I'm still working on the new review recording area, the new studio I'm building out. It's coming and it actually should get finished this week, but it's not there yet and it's kind of taking about every second I've got to get that space ready. So right now we're just gonna have one out in the shop here, a quick review on this Douk A100. It's kind of an interesting amplifier. It's heavy as a brick for one thing, has a different look to it. I'm gonna give you guys a little bit closer look on some of the features and some of the things that this one can do. So you've got some kind of interesting options in this one. It's a little bit different than some of the other configurations we've seen. You can simply use this as a stereo amplifier like a lot of people will, or you could use this for stereo subs. You could switch it over to mono mode and you could have that hooked up to a sub, or you could use this as mono blocks for your passive speakers, because this is an amplifier that's designed for either passive speakers or passive subs. And then simply you can turn it off right here. And then you see the second switch here. It says flat and sub. So if you have it in flat, that's when you're going to be powering this up to your speakers, all your passive speakers, that kind of thing. And then sub mode. And that is when you're going to have this obviously with a passive sub. And that does a couple things when you switch this flat to sub button. There's 4 buttons here, but not all of these are going to be in use. When you have it in sub mode here, that's when we have access to the super bass to adjust the gain. And then we have the subwoofer frequency. And one thing I'd just like to point out right off the bat, I really wish they would list the actual, frequency numbers here so it isn't so much of a guessing game. You do get a range and that is included in the pamphlet that this one comes with, but it's something that could have been here and would have been a little bit more useful for people, I think. And then if you go into flat mode, you get this auxiliary volume, because if you flip it around, we do have an auxiliary out. And then we also have just your standard volume pot here. And some interesting points on that one would be the auxiliary volume does control this auxiliary output, obviously. So if you have this hooked up to an active sub, you are going to have to control that active sub volume separately with this auxiliary volume. I wish that would have been, controlled through the main volume. Makes it a little bit easier to integrate an active sub in something like this one. So basically a little bit for everyone here. You might use something like this if you're building a passive sub for one. Maybe you have an older sub and the amp has given up. You could easily bring something like this in, integrate it, have it up and running again, and have all your, your gain controls right here, subwoofer frequency, all of that. Then, you could also probably mow your lawn, wash your clothes, cook dinner. I wish I could do all of those. That would really help. So yeah, this does a little bit of everything. And no, I don't have any passive subs to actually test this with. I did hook it up to my speakers and just kind of play it off as a sub, that kind of thing. And once again, I still kind of need to build one of those passive subs so I can test more of these, since for some reason it seems like every other one lately of these smaller amps like this is coming in with passive sub capabilities. But I still think the most obvious use case for something like this is just going to be your stereo amplifier. And it does pretty well in that too. It's your typical amp chip, the 3255, all that power there. And it does come with a 48 volt 5 amp power supply. So we're sitting good with that. Heat is not a problem with this one. As you can see here, looking at it, there's lots of fins here. It's kind of an interesting design, and it's one of those, the whole case has a heat sink, all of that. It works out well. You can pretty much run this thing forever and it's not gonna overheat. It's heavy too. It really, it's a nice little machined block of aluminum here, and it does transfer the heat really well. I didn't have any problems running this at loud volumes for long periods of time. It still just, felt warm. I think this would be great if you maybe had this in a garage that gets hot. This would be a really good option there where you don't have to worry about things getting a little bit too warm. This is one of those where you look at the design online, you see pictures of it, and you're kind of like, oh, I don't know about that in the looks department. But it really does look better when you have it in hand. It's pretty, it's pretty well constructed. The fins are kind of a lot. And so is the branding here. That's one area where I wish they would tone it down just a little bit. We don't quite need that so big on this. Maybe just a logo, something like that would class this one up a little bit. It's just a little bit bold right in the front here. But overall, it's actually a pretty cool design if you get your hands on it. Taking a little closer look at the back here, we have the RCA inputs, that auxiliary out I mentioned. And then you have some nice size binding posts here, which is good to see. And you can see this marked here for mono. So if you're gonna use this in mono mode, you're just gonna be using the 2 outside ones. Otherwise, standard stereo, than the power supply, which accepts up to the 48 volt, which is included. They have made some improvements in their amp designs over at Douk. They are now including PFFB on this one, which is good to see. That can just kind of clean things up in the upper registries. Depending on the speaker pairing you have with this, if you don't have PFFB, you can either have, gain increases, you can have nulls. It can do kind of a lot of wild things at the far end of the frequency response, either up or down, and it can change the way things sound. And it makes it kind of hard to review things like this because you don't know how people are going to pair these with what types of speakers, because it greatly depends on what speaker you're pairing with it, if you'll hear that difference or not. And if you'd hear the difference, that's neither here or there either. I mean, it kind of depends. It's not as much of a thing as some people say it is. It's a bit exaggerated, but it is something that definitely needed to be included on these Class D amps. It's a feature that needed to happen on these. It's kind of that next step in improving some of these cheaper designs. And a lot of them are starting to include it, and that's really cool to see. We're getting to that point now where these budget designs, that they're starting to push them more and more forward. We're slowly getting on these new add-ons, things like that are making them better and better. We're starting to stack on some of these gains, and I really like to see that coming on all these amps. This one does have swappable op amps. If you guys stick around to the end of the video, I'll just show the disassembly process and show you what that looks like as far as the chip and the design, the heatsink, all of that, and where the swappable op amps are. And we'll see how much room we have and what we can actually fit there. During my testing with this one, I really didn't have any problems. Everything worked out pretty well on this. It's pretty clean design. Like I said, some of the only things that bothered me a little earlier was that auxiliary volume, I have to control the sub volume separately, which I'd rather just control that with your standard volume, because you don't want to really be turning two knobs to adjust your subs and your stereo speakers. That's just kind of a pain. Other than that, the volume knob with the potentiometer, you will notice that you have to really crank it up to about 3/4 before it really starts bringing that volume up. It really ramps up from there. But in my use case, I would probably have this somewhere around that 3/4 to full volume mark and just leave it there and just use this as a powered amplifier. And this would be connected to something like, the Wii Ultra, and I would just use that as my preamp to control the volume. So that's really not a problem for me in that case. The other great thing about pairing this with the Wii Ultra would be that it would eliminate that auxiliary out problem with the sub, where the volume control, because we would just have that plugged into the Wii Ultra. We'd let that handle all the sub control, and then you can set all your crossovers, your room correction, all that kind of thing on that unit, rather than this amp itself. Then we could just use this amp to amplify the speakers and let it handle what it can handle and what it does best. As for the pros on this one, I think it's a really good design. The heat dissipation is great on this one. It's built really solid. It has a lot of usability. I mean, you can use this for subs, passive speakers, all of that. Everything feels pretty good on it. These have a nice little clicky feel to them. Everything feels good there, and you flip it around. We have the good binding posts. They give us the bigger power supply, which is great to see. And really, my only cons, if I had to point something out, would be maybe shrink the branding a little bit, and for all the people who aren't going to be using something like a Wii Ultra to help out with that sub, I would just have that auxiliary out controlled through the actual volume. Just have a standard pre out there. That would really help out a lot of people. But outside of that, I can't really think of any major cons with this one. It's a cool little unit, and I'm looking forward to some more of the products that Douk puts out, because they're starting to branch out and really make some interesting stuff here. And yeah, I'll have to eventually make that passive sub, and maybe we can come back and actually test something like this on that and see how well it does and see how big of a sub you could push with something like this.